where again, yeah, as I said, there'll be a lot of kind of talking at you, but please do make a note of any questions that you have, and we will have an opportunity for a Q&A at the end of that session. And then we'll also bring in my colleagues Alexia, Alex and Rebecca to talk you through the updates to the self-assessment questionnaire as well. We probably will spend more time focused on the risk assessment tool because, as those of you who have been at the previous SSS will know, we've already provided quite an update on the new SAQ previously, and this will be the first time that we're really going into depth in terms of the risk assessment tool updates. So I'm joined here by Stuart, again from Ergon Associates, and also Tim Croker from Anthesis, who, as we mentioned earlier, we've been working with to build the new risk assessment tool. So I'll take you through some of the key changes and with the new tool, and then Tim will talk you through more specifically around how the scoring calculations will work and some of the indices we'll be using within the tool. And Stuart will talk you through, although Ergon have been supporting us with many components of the tool, they specifically developed a forced labour index, which Stuart will talk to you about in more detail. So we'll start just with a quick show of hands for to see how many people here actually currently use the Sedex risk assessment tool. Just raise your hand if you do. Probably about a third of people. Out of interest as well, is there anyone here who maybe previously used the Sedex tool but no longer does and uses another form of risk assessment? You won't be offended? Okay, a couple of people, 4 people, great. Okay, lovely, let's move on then. Okay, so quick recap of what we're doing here. So essentially we've been working closely with Anthesis over the course of this year to build a completely new version of Sedex's risk assessment tool. The aim of that tool, of course, is to support our members globally in identifying their key human rights, labour standards, governance and environmental risks, both within their own operations and further in the supply chain, in order then to highlight what opportunities there might be to carry out further due diligence activities, as Stuart talked of earlier. And we recognise, of course, that we have quite a breadth of Sedex members, so we've really tried to design the tool with that in mind, so making it both applicable to those Sedex members who are large, kind of multinational organisations with huge, complex global supply chains, but also to make sure that it's relevant to those of you who might be using the tool to meet legislative requirements or to meet the requirements of a customer who's asking you to kind of assess the risk in your own supply chain. And equally, for the first time, we've been looking at whether some of the reports available in the tool might be useful to auditors as well. So just to summarise how we capture risk within the Sedex platform is remaining largely the same as it does in the current tool. So we take both the risks associated with a particular country and a particular sector, and then we overlay that with information provided about a particular, or provided from a site in terms of their site profile and SAQ information, and we really combine that information together to create an overall risk score for a particular site. And those scores are, of course, then segmented by the different pillars of Sedex, so labour standards, health and safety, the environment and business ethics, and aggregated into an overall risk score for a particular supplier. However, of course, there will be significant changes that we'll be making as we're building this tool completely from scratch. And I'll go into each of these in more detail, but some of the main things you can see there are that we will be changing the types of questions that are risk assessed from the SAQ and site profile within the tool. We'll also be trying to make much better use of the data that's available to members in terms of highlighting where there might be particularly vulnerable types of worker within the supply chain. And we'll no longer be sourcing the risk information from Verisk Maplecroft. We'll actually be using publicly available risk indicators, which Tim will talk about in more detail. But essentially what that enables us to do, as well as being really transparent about the sources of the data that's providing the risk scores, allows us to go further down into the types of issue that might be prevalent. So not just looking at labour standards as a general bucket, but really trying to understand whether it might be discrimination or forced labour that's the risk in that particular site. in order that members can then tailor their approach according to the particular challenge. So, yeah, to build on how we'll be changing the approach that we're using to, in terms of the SAQ information, we'll really be looking to reduce the reliance that we currently have on a lot of the self-declared information about management policies and processes. And really there's two reasons for that. One is that I guess by risk assessing that information, we recognise that we're creating an incentive for some suppliers to provide the positive answer, particularly if they know that that will in turn reduce their risk, which may have consequences in terms of perhaps the frequency of audits that they're required to undertake. And secondly, just the things around, I guess, the kind of things around policy and training are generally considered to be fairly weak indicators of practice. And I think the chart that we've got here on the screen really illustrates this. So you can see on the left-hand side, when we take a sample of 6,000 sites and we analyse the risk scores that come out of their SAQ alone, almost all of them come out as low risk, and a small proportion come out as medium risk, and almost none come out as high risk. Whereas when you look at those same sites in terms of the inherent risks for those sites, it's almost the inverse. You can see that there's a small proportion that are actually low risk, whereas the vast majority are either medium or high risk. And when we kind of merge these two sets of information, there's a risk that we are potentially kind of deflating the overall risk scores for some of those sites. And what we really want to do is make sure that our tools are reflecting the actual risks to human rights and the environment. So what we'll be doing instead in the new tool, and we're proposing, is to really take more of a focus on the hard kind of facts and data that's shared by a site about the types of workers that they employ, how they're recruited, the types of contracts they're on, and we'll be calling that the site characteristics score. But of course, we don't want to lose visibility of those suppliers who are taking a lot of action to, develop training and implement policies and be involved in improvement projects. So that information will now go into a new management control score, which will be presented in the tool and also available to suppliers to see how, so they can see how they monitor their progress over time, but it won't actually affect the site's overall risk score. And then the other way that we'll be using the SAQ data, I guess building on this, is that when we start to look more at the types of worker that are employed, we can really bring into focus those workers who might be vulnerable to exploitation. And this is really in line with the approach recommended by the guiding principles that many of you will be familiar with, that requires businesses to pay particular attention to those at heightened risk of becoming vulnerable or marginalised. And there is, of course, many different categories of people that could affect, but in the context of the information available to you on Sedex and in the context of supply chains, the categories we'll be focusing on, as you can see on the screen here, are women and migrant workers who, obviously, whilst not inherently vulnerable, do find themselves disproportionately exposed to the most vulnerable situations in a workforce, and also temporary workers who may not be entitled to the same wages and benefits as employees, and there also tends to be a higher concentration of those vulnerable worker types within these roles. And then finally, workers who are located off-site, who tend to be more vulnerable due to the hidden nature of their work. And I also just wanted to talk about how we'll be using audit data in the new tool, because at the very outset of this project, when we were gathering feedback on the current tool, it was kind of noted and recommended to us that the current tool really doesn't make good use of the audit information for a particular site. And so we did consider whether a site's audit results should actually feed into their overall risk score, but really concluded that the two tools are trying to do slightly different things. So the risk assessment tool is trying to anticipate the risk, as Stuart talked about earlier, whereas an audit is trying to confirm whether those risks may be present. So it's important that those two elements are kept separated. However, what we will do is build much more visibility of a site's audit results into the views within the tool. So you'll be able to see whether those risks have been confirmed or not, and that table there kind of illustrates be presented. Will also be, when you're looking at your supply chain at an aggregated level, using the audit data available to you to see so you can see which types of issues have been picked up through audit. So now I will hand over to Tim, who will talk a bit more about the issue-based indicators that we'll be using within the
tool. Thanks for inviting me here to talk. I'm Tim. I work for Anthesis, and we've been working with Sedex for a long time now to bring this new risk assessment tool to fruition. As Tom said, we've built it from scratch, from the ground up, and yeah, it's going to be something, and it really is something quite good. I'm impressed with it. It's good. I'll give you a bit of background. I'll let you read all of that, but the interesting stuff is really Sedex is a very broad sustainability consultancy, but the resources that we've brought to this particular piece of work, we've got supply chain specialists, supply chain risk specialists, which is obviously fairly important. We've got statisticians who are able to basically look at all of the indicators and look at particular ways to combine them and choose indicators. We've got project researchers who have been delving through the internet and other sources to look at various sources of data to support this tool. We've got analysts, the number crunchers like myself, who take all the numbers, convert them into something useful, and try and make sense of them. We've got the visualization team who basically then create the front end of the tool, which again is something. I don't know if you've shown slides of what it looks like. Yeah, not yet. Okay, well, that's something to come. This beautiful graphical user interface, which will hopefully be really user-friendly and really able to see those risks. And finally, our software team, who have basically taken lots of Excel spreadsheets and turned them into Python code, which works together. So we've brought together basically from across Anthesis the best and most relevant people to work on this. Right, so inherent risks. As Tom said, the inherent risks are based on the country and also based on the sector or some industry that the site is working in. And what they assess is purely based on those two things. So it's before they've had an audit, it's before they've included any SAQ information or any site profile information. So what it's looking at is really, given that a site is operating in this country, given that they're operating in this particular sector or this particular industry, what are the risks associated with that site? And these are assessed, as Tom said, no longer at the pillar level, the labour standards and rights, health and safety. They're actually assessed across all of the clauses. So we've got forced labour, which Stuart will talk about, and then freedom of association, wages, working hours, discrimination, biodiversity, waste and pollution, water, and all of the others. So what we've ended up now is a score, each combination really of country with industry and clause. So you can really, as Tom said, delve right into the detail of what the risk is and what's driving these risks. We've also given additional points. Unfortunately, points don't mean prizes, they mean bad things in this case. Additional scores for industries or particular combinations of goods and countries, which I will talk about in a bit. So it's a much more detailed, not many people are familiar with the old tool, but it's a really as detailed as we can make it. Scoring is 1 to 10. So the country gets a score of 1 to 8. So all of the country indicators, which I'll come to in a moment, basically form 8 out of 10 of the final score. And then the sector and product, sectors in twice, it's very important. The sector and the product scored 2, and that overall gives you a score of 10. Right, so I'll now move on to okay. So the country indicators, I said they're broken down into clauses, and each clause is made up of one or more indicators. And they were picked, say, from a universe of indicators based on how relevant they were to each clause, whether or not they covered. We've got 248 countries or states in the tool. So what we wanted to make sure is each of the indicators covered as many of those as possible. As Tom's already said, they needed to be broadly publicly available, which gives you that transparency of where they're coming from and allows anyone to really look into those. They need to be updated fairly frequently to keep them relevant. And also one thing, but that's basically sort of quality. They need to come from a source and be of a certain standard that meets the needs. And out of the whole universe of indicators, of which there were many, 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 we gradually narrowed them down. The ones which really focused in on the clauses, did some stats work to make sure that there wasn't any that was sort of doubling up or where there was a correlation between those two, to come up with a final set of indicators that contribute to each of the clause scores. So on here, or on there, if you're outside the room, there's some of the logos of some of the sources there. World Bank, World Economic Forum, UNICEF, Freedom House, and World Resources Institute for the environmental ones. And basically, as broader set of indicators as that we could use. And there are just a couple of examples there. So for example, discrimination, we've looked at Freedom House, Freedom to Practice Beliefs. For child labour, we've looked at Global Child Forum, which is children's rights in the workplace. For gender issues, we use the UN Global Inequality, Gender Inequality Index and the Gender Gap Index. And for environment, we used the Yale Environmental Scores, for example. And yeah, if you want any more detail, I've got a whole list of them, which I can read out, but that's where we are on those. And then that gives you a sort of, based on all of those indicators, you've got a score of 1 to 8. And then we've got the other 2 points, which come from the sector which the site works in, and in some cases, the products that they produce. So again, we've done research into across these sectors. So it's basically using an ISIC class, for those familiar with those, section, which is sort of A to Z, where you've got things like agriculture, forestry and fishing, mining, manufacturing. And then across each of the clauses, we've looked at various sources of information to try and determine what, given that a site operates in those sectors, are there any particular risks associated with forced labour, any particular risks associated with child labour, or discrimination, or the environment. And then that gives an extra score on top. And then finally, if there is a particular combination of country and good, then they get an additional boost, as I said. So, for example, producing soy, or producing timber, or producing cattle in many Latin American countries is pretty heavily related to deforestation. So that will get a boost in the biodiversity score. And garment manufacturing in Bangladesh, or indeed cotton production in many Asian countries, is associated with either child labour or forced labour. So they will also get an additional score. Now, there have been, as Sana said, we've drawn on the best available indicators that we can. And there was one area, important area, forced labour, where the publicly available indicators weren't really up to scratch. So Sedex commissioned Ergon to produce the forced labour index, which combines sort of country and sector risk. And I'll pass over to Stuart.
So Anthesis have really done the kind of bulk of work in terms of putting all these indicators together. We were asked to work specifically just on the forced labour index, and I think why is there a different approach here, or a slightly different approach? Well, I mean, obviously, forced labour, modern slavery is probably the key issue that certainly legislatively we're all concerned about. So there's a big focus on it. And secondly, compared with many of the other issues, it's kind of more hidden. There's less direct indicators, direct data that you can draw on. Whereas, there's good immediate data on, say, working hours or wage levels or numbers of informal workers. There are not international statistics on the number of people in forced labour, in spite of what the Walk Free Foundation might suggest. It's not to say that those estimates are not useful, but they are estimates and extrapolations. We think that there's probably slightly better ways of trying to get to risk than simply relying on those global estimates. So, I mean, the approach on forced labour is exactly the same. So the whole set of country indicators and then the sector indicators. But just to think about some of the country indicators, and again, we're thinking about the drivers behind, the factors that are contributing to the risks of forced labour, and it's very much aligned with the sort of ILO approach of what are the indicators of forced labour, rather than being able to say definitely forced labour is happening here. It's a combination of accumulation of indicators. And one of the key issues is migration. Migrant workers are at more risk of forced labour than many other groups of workers and are more vulnerable to it. In many of the existing sets of stats, this is missed. So you see a ranking of high-risk countries, and developed countries, USA, Western Europe, tend to come out pretty low in terms of risks of forced labour. Whereas we know that sort of economies are very reliant on low-skilled migrant workers, sometimes trafficked, as is coming to the light more and more. So if you don't take account of the volume of migrant workers, I think you end up with a slightly skewed picture on risks of forced labour. So we built a migration component which basically looks at the proportion of migrant workers within a country's workforce, and particularly migrant workers coming from high-risk sending countries. So that's a component in this set of indicators. Other sorts of drivers are around quality of governance in general, law enforcement, levels of poverty, informal workers, so how big is the informal economy, how many workers within the informal economy, vulnerability of minorities, how vulnerable minorities are treated, and level of trafficking. So we're using some of the same sources that Tim has talked about in terms of credible international data sets, but they tend to be proxies for forced labour. So they're data around these contributing underlying factors of forced labour. Combined with that is sector research. So we've done focused desk research on 4 key product sectors, which are agriculture, food processing, light manufacturing, which basically captures garments, electronics assembly, homewares, and transport and logistics as well, so warehousing and transport. And that desk research has looked for specific instances, reports, NGO reports, media reports, international agency surveys, which have identified particular instances, examples of forced labour in these sectors in particular countries. So we've done that for all of the 250 countries. I have to say this was quite a geography lesson for me as well. I didn't know there were so many small Antarctic islands. It's probably not in your supply chains, but anyway, we've covered them all. And that desk research is categorised according to whether there is endemic, persistent, well-documented risk, occasional, undocumented or unverified risks, or no information whatsoever. So that sector score adds to the country-based score for forced labour.
Okay, so what does this all mean then? Essentially, the risk assessment tool will be a suite of 7 different reports, some of which will have their own sub-reports. It will be hosted in the Sedex Analytics platform with its own kind of risk assessment tool folder for those of you who are familiar with that platform, and it can make use of all the functionality and user interface that's available within that. You can see here the 7 different reports. I've got some screenshots of the majority of those, apart from the one in the middle there, the risk analysis report, which will be the one that draws on those vulnerable worker types to highlight whether you might have workers at heightened risk of vulnerability within your supply chain, but we'll go on to the other ones now. So the first couple of reports will be, well, just to say as well that the way we've created these reports are first looking at the functionality that's available in the current risk assessment tool, and then thinking about, how do we achieve some of the other aims that we want to do in terms of highlighting those vulnerabilities, and then how do we best present this information. So one of the features that some of you will be familiar with in the current tool is a pre-screening tool, which allows you to understand the risk of a particular country and sector disconnected from your actual supply chain data. So this report has been replicated in a more kind of visual and intuitive way, but also breaking down those risks into individual pillars, as you can see there. And also what we'll be doing is, in addition to the kind of indicator data, we'll be compiling a database of reports from the media or NGOs that relate to specific risks within particular countries, and presenting that information back within this report. So if there's kind of any breaking information that comes out, you'll be able to see that through here, and also that will help to kind of drive you towards further information to understand the context of particular risks, if they might be occurring within a specific region within a country or something like that. So that's what this report will do, and there'll be a second version of this report, where essentially is probably most useful for those new to Sedex who haven't yet onboarded to the Sedex platform, any of their suppliers, but they'll be able to upload like an Excel file of identifying the key characteristics of those sites in terms of the country they're located in, the sector that they're involved with, and the product they produce. Upload that information into the tool, and it will return back the inherent risk scores for those sites, which will enable you to understand which are the sites that perhaps I need to ask to register on the Sedex platform and complete the questionnaire. And you'll also be able to input your own proprietary data in terms of levels of spend and things like that to help you understand which suppliers to focus on. The next report, the risk assessment matrix, is more the typical kind of overall supply chain risk assessment, which will enable you to categorize your suppliers according to their risks. So in this kind of visual view, you'll have on one axis the inherent risk score of your sites, and on the other axis you'll have the site characteristics risk score. So clearly, if a supplier is appearing in the top right-hand quadrant, then that means they've got both high inherent risk, i.e. they're in a country and sector that has a naturally high risk, and also the characteristics of that site may give rise to those issues being more likely to occur. You'll be able to, from this, click on that site and drill down into it to see more details about that particular site. And with all of these reports, you'll be able to switch from this kind of visual view to the more statistical table report view, where you can then see, okay, what are the particular risk scores coming out for this specific site by the different clauses. And again, that will be aggregated into that overall risk score as well. And you can also see here that we'll be presenting back the audit data related to those suppliers as well, so you can see what types of issues are coming up through audit as well. So then if I were to click on one of those sites and drill down, I should probably caveat that these are all kind of work in progress at the moment, so these won't be the final versions, but hopefully you can see that when you are looking at a specific site, you'll have a dashboard of all sorts of information related to the specific site. So they'll be located on a map. You'll be able to see a summary of the developer's profile, all of the risk scores associated with that site, of course, and also you can see there the new management controls report, which I think we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in the next session. But you'll also be able to drill down from this into a series of sub-reports that provide that information about the site's most recent audit. We'll also be able to include some sub-national level data sets. So you can see here the site, the information is displaying water risk for that particular site, and you can see that it's located in an area of high water stress. And there's a couple of other sub-national indices that we've been able to include within the tool as well to provide that more kind of location-specific risk information. You'll also be able to benchmark a site to compare it with other similar sites in that country or sector or producing the same product. From here, you will also be able to look at the activity that the site's undertaking, whether they're a manufacturer of wine or a grower of grapes, and see whether there's specific risks associated with that product or activity, either within its supply chain or actually in the immediate production of that product. So that takes us on to the next report, which is actually a set of different reports related to these high-risk products. So they really draw on, again, publicly available information about the risk of specifically forced labour, child labour or deforestation, drawing on information provided by the US Department of Labour with their list of goods produced by forced and child labour, and also the Canopy's Forest 500 list of goods heavily connected with deforestation. And you'll be able to, as well, this will draw in trade data, so you'll be able to compare whether that particular site, how that compares to other key export markets in terms of those specific risks. And there will be a view of this where you can also just look at a specific commodity or good that has one of these risks associated with it and see which countries that specifically relates to. And this is one of the reports, along with the pre-screening report, that we'll look to make available to auditors if they can find that useful too. And the final report that I'll show you, as you can see, there's a lot going on with these various reports, but what we'll also be doing is not building a completely new report, but taking our existing forced labour indicator set of reports and into that a lot of the work that's going into the risk assessment tool specifically related to forced labour. So overlaying the forced labour indicator data with the actual risk of forced labour in that country according to the index that Stuart talked about, and also taking some of those other elements from the risk tool that specifically highlight whether there might be a heightened risk of forced labour. And again, using the functionality available in the platform to present that information back in a much more analytical way. And we've also, in parallel to this, been working with the Mekong Club, who many of you will probably know as experts on modern slavery, to review the current set of issue titles used as indicators of forced labour, to really see the appropriateness of those indicators and whether any kind of strengths or the categories should be recategorised to make sure that this report is really doing its best to highlight where there may be indicators of forced labour that require further investigation. That is a set of reports. There are, of course, as I said, many more layers to it, and these are all currently in development, so they will change over time, but hopefully it gives you a sense for how the new tool is progressing. What you can see here now is the transition timeline. So clearly, we recognise that releasing a completely new SAQ and a completely new risk assessment tool that use different methodologies is a significant change for Sedex, and there will be impacts for this. So clearly now the Maple tool is live, and as we're developing this new tool, I'm beginning to host a series of webinars, as Mark said, to really help people prepare for the change, and what we're doing today as well. And then once the new products are launched, we will retain the Maplecroft scores. So any sites who are currently to you on Sedex, their risk scores from the Maplecroft tool will remain visible for a period of 12 months. So there's essentially a 12-month transition period for those sites to complete the new SAQ and receive the new scores within the new tool. And we'll also create a report that really easily enables you to compare the risk score from the previous tool and the risk score to the current tool. Clearly, the new SAQ, the more information you get from this new tool, but we do transition between the two tools, and so hopefully this helps. I think we'll talk a bit more about the SAQ transition plan in the next session, but that's probably it for a lot of talking about the risk assessment tool. Before my colleagues come in and talk about the SAQ, we have an opportunity for any questions for people that we will take now.
John Tuckwell from FICE. Excuse me. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understood this, you're going to take country and product plus SAQ questions. That doesn't seem to me to be logical, because if you are doing the very best you can and perfect, you're still going to be high risk because of the country and product that you're dealing with. Surely it would be better to use the SAQ questions to take away from that score, just to show how good, bad you really are.
Yeah, well, I can take that one. What we're showing is, as Tom showed, there is a 2x2 axis. You've got the inherent score on one axis, and you've got the site characteristic score on the other axis. So it's a case of looking at both of them. As Tom said, we're trying to draw on the real site characteristics, which are not necessarily to do with management actions. In fact, they're not taking into account anything that the site does to mitigate risks. They're purely based, or largely based, on the types of workers and how they're managed on the site. So it has to be looking at a combination of the two. Would you want to add anything more to?
Yeah, so I think it's a change in the way that the SAQ and site profile information will be used. So it will still be factored in, but it will be more focused on those characteristics. So if you're a supplier who is in a country with a high risk of migrant worker exploitation, then your inherent risk would be high. But actually, if you're not employing any migrant workers and all your workers are locally employed permanent workers, then that would in turn reduce that risk. The information about the kind of the training that's been implemented and the policies and the involvement with any improvement projects will be separated out into this management control score, which will still be visible to understand, what is the supplier doing to mitigate any risks that they have. However, for the reasons we kind of discussed, we've decided that it would be most appropriate to split out those two elements.
So if you are fair trade certified but in a high-risk country, you're still going to be high risk?
Well, it would depend on the characteristics of that site, but yeah, the kind of certification element would fall more into the management control side of things. So yeah, essentially, if you're in a high-risk country and you have a workforce and recruitment methods that are high risk, then your risk score, separate from the management control score, you would expect to be high. So yeah, what we're saying is the nature of that site and the location it's in indicates that it would be higher risk.
Thanks very much, Lee from Envido. I want to salute the thoroughness and the hard work that's clearly gone into this. And I think the irony about risk assessment systems and risk analytics is the better they become, the greater the temptation to rely solely on the risk analytics. And I think there's a real opportunity in this case to demonstrate some better practice and to have some health warnings on the system to say, this is the bigger picture. And this is also in response to John's point earlier, this is the bigger picture. This is anticipated risk on the basis of context and profiling, broad profiling. And this is in no way to suggest that buyers or suppliers invest less time in direct engagement and less time in the actuals. Because as I know quite a few Sedex members who are currently kind of relying predominantly on the risk and assessment tool. And I think, you know, ironically, that carries a risk in itself, and you don't want it to backfire, you know, and for there to be some cases that prove that, you know, some things are happening in low risk environments, and for people then to discredit your system and your hard work. So I think just a mention that I think, you know, it's very important to constantly reiterate that this is contextual risk and is in no way to discourage brands and suppliers from the actuals, from direct engagement and providing actual evidence from the site.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know there wasn't a question there, it was more of a comment, but yeah, we agree with you wholeheartedly. And I guess that's where the guidance that Ergon had produced in terms of what we're terming best practice and Stuart is kind of terming a general guide to risk assessment is really going to, that's why we're making sure that that goes into all training associated with the tool so that people understand what the tool does, what it doesn't do, and what some of the actions they can take are next in order to find the evidence, and it is about anticipating risk.
Do all the reports pivot on the current relationships that you have already in the system through suppliers down to site?
Do they pivot? I think I know what you mean.
So, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so they will, in the initial view, it will show analysis related to all of the suppliers connected to you. There'll be a series of filters available in each of the reports that will enable you to, if you have unique references for particular suppliers, you can filter by that. If you want to be able to filter by specific suppliers or direct suppliers, you'll be able to do that. We've also implemented a feature which enables you to filter by whether the supplier is at the primary material stage or further or closer to you in the supply chain, in order to see if there's a distinction between the risks there. And what we're looking at doing as well is enabling the ability for those users who don't necessarily kind of maintain the active links within their Sedex account to allow those to kind of upload a file which identifies the sites that are active, or you might add additional proprietary data around your levels of spend, etc. And those could be incorporated into those filters. So essentially, when you're looking at the analysis, you can remove the suppliers that are not relevant to you and make sure that that's providing an accurate picture of what it is you want to understand. And again, if you've got like subsidiary structures, you'll be able to filter by different accounts or what have you. So there's a series of different filters that enable you to do that. Does that answer the question that you're asking? Yeah. Oh, microphone.
It's just a quick question. Historically, the risk assessment has only been available to the AB and A members. Will this analysis be available to all members?
So it will stay the same in the sense that if you are an A or an AB member, then that membership entitles you to access to the risk assessment tool. So these reports and the functionality wouldn't be available to a supplier member. However, there will be the ability for individual buyers to pull off that kind of site view report and share that with the supplier. So we're not, opposed to the principle of sharing the risk information with a particular supplier, particularly when it comes to, the inherent risk information. However, it won't be immediately visible to them, except for the management controls element, which will be a report that a supplier can use to see how they could potentially improve their management systems and that progress over time.
And the whole picture.
Yeah, so the set of reports will only be available to the A and AB members, but they would have the ability to kind of download that report and share it with a particular supplier if they wanted to. But we're currently leaving it at the discretion of the individual buyers. And then I think when we look to the new platform that Sedex is building, we'll think about how that could potentially change. But I think within the scope of this, we recognise that if we were to just immediately share everything with everyone, we would need to do a lot more training than we currently do. And so we're not probably quite at that stage, but it's something that we'll think about going forward.
Hi, Simon Lee from Ley Domain. We're a grower member. We've noticed a lot of the retailers are moving away from the Sedex risk assessment onto things like the FNet assessment, which we have a few concerns with. I wondered if Sedex doing anything to try and bring the A members back on board with the risk assessment.
Trying to make it really good. And, hopefully that means that, I mean, we did have a few people say actually that they've moved away from the Sedex tool to other tools. I don't know if anyone would like to share the reasons behind that and whether anything we've presented today might change that or not. If anyone is willing to speak up, then that would be good. But yeah, I mean, clearly we would love people to come back and use the Sedex tool. But if there are still reasons why other tools are more appropriate for a particular sector or industry, then we recognise that is something that may occur. But yeah, clearly we would love them to come back. You got a question on the webinar? Alex?
Yeah, one online from Abigail Balikal. Sorry if that's not how you pronounce your name. For benchmarking, how specific can you get?
So the benchmarking, Tim, how familiar are you with this? Do you want me to cover that?
It's all of the scores are 1 to 10, so yes, you'll be able to compare. Somebody who's got an 8 score, it will be obviously higher risk than somebody who's got a 2 score, and you'll also be able to look at within your supply chain the average of suppliers in your supply chain, and you'll also be able to look at the average of sites or people within that same industry. Say that, isn't it? So you'll be able to see how other similar sites, so the average, and compare yourself against those.
Yeah, so you can use it in different ways. So one of the changes that we'll be covering next is the way that we actually a site selects what it is that they do. And essentially, that will be in a structure of a tree structure of 4 different components. One is the activity that they undertake, which is then grouped into different categories going up to the sector. And so we'll be able to compare sites according to other similar sites based on that activity or that sector or that country, and again, both within the user's supply chain and against all of Sedex data as well to see those different components. So there'll be lots of different benchmarking depending on what people want to be able to do. Okay, well, should we take one more question and then we'll probably need to move on to the SAQ update.
My name is Manal Saleh. I come from Egypt. If it is not possible to share the tool with the suppliers because you're a bit worried about the training, can you issue like quarterly reports or something in a PDF format so that they are aware of what can have an impact on them in the eyes of their customers?
Not automatically. I'm not 100% sure with the ability of Sedex Analytics to do that. I have a feeling you might be able to, as a buyer, set up reports that can go out automatically. And yeah, Rachel's nodding. That's a good sign. So I think as an individual buyer, you could take that decision to say, okay, send me this report on a quarterly basis, and I'll in turn share that with my supplier. Equally, one of the I want to steal the thunder from the SAQ group, but one of the features of the new SAQ is that we'll be saving or have the ability to save the answers completed by a site within the SAQ, which is something new which will enable us to then monitor progress over time. So particularly when it comes to that management controls report, you'll be able to kind of take a snapshot of how that supplier is performing at one time, and then again 6 months or a year, and see the progress that they're making. So that's kind of on the management control side rather than the inherent risk, which we would anticipate changing less often.
I'm not talking about individual sites. I'm talking about the country itself, the risks concerning the country, because from what I understand, if the country is labeled as a high risk, then automatically the suppliers are also within the profile of the country. So at least the suppliers in the country of origin have a clear view on how they are overall rated. So maybe if you can issue like quarter reports that are in a PDF format that doesn't need a lot of training or anything, that they can download and know comparatively about the country of origin.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, useful.